Yeah, so when they asked me to speak something about at the tech stage, I really thought about what can I basically help you guys understand if there's some lessons that we learned, because I'm not trying to sell any product or anything. I think it would be a good session if there's some interesting thoughts that you think might be interesting of this, and you could actually use it for something you would be doing in the future. And why do we even talk about that? We're trying to do something in Berlin that is, at the moment, still pretty unique. It's not necessarily a good thing. It might also be that you're the only one driving on the wrong side of the street, and any moment you're about to collide with another car. But for the time being, we're trying to do that. First of all, we are a venture capital firm, so we invest out of a fund of roughly $100 million US. We invest into early stage, seed stage startups in the traditional sectors like B2B, B2C, online, internet-based, e-commerce, software as a service, mobile, the classical stuff. We're based in Berlin mostly, so a lot of our deal flow is in Europe. We also have an office in Brazil and Sao Paulo, so we do a lot of stuff there. And we do the occasional thing somewhere over the world. We have one investment in Singapore, we have one in London, we have one in Los Angeles. So we're not really bound to a special territory. And what we're trying to do really is help people build their companies, not only by investing cash, which they obviously need to run their companies, but also to help them through experts, processes, and knowledge that we have gained in the past years. And we do that through 120 people that we have on our own staff. So it's full-time employees, 120 that we have, and they work with the companies. Now you mentioned holding hands. Yes, we do that, but also it's mainly a resource, right? So it's a classic venture capital deal mostly, and then we offer you on top, don't you want to work with those people? Don't you want to use our software? Don't you want to, come into our framework contracts that we have with some service providers? That's the idea. And that's pretty similar to what my partners and I have been doing in 2007 when we were the founding team for a thing called Rocket Internet in Berlin, which is a pretty big startup incubator, probably known for Zalando, which is an e-commerce website for fashion, and which has spun out into all of the world under different names. And we've also been involved heavily in the City Deal Groupon thing and some things like that. We started that pretty small in 2007, more as of a think tank, kind of similar actually to what Project A is today. But then it has grown quite well, and the employees, it's in the thousands nowadays. So that has been quite successful. And one of the things that we try to do is think about how can we actually leverage things across the portfolio without being too hand-holding, without limiting entrepreneurial freedom. So for us, it's very important to combine a incubation-like model, so where there's a lot of support, but still have entrepreneurs who are strong enough to make their own decisions. Everything we do, it's just an offer that we give to the people, and if they decide to take it, we're happy to give it to them, but there's no mechanism of force or anything like that. So that is really important to us. And one thing where this works very well, obviously, is software. So if we build software in our central infrastructure, if we create intellectual property for a lot of purposes, there's a high likelihood that individual startups will benefit from that. Just one example, we work a lot with business intelligence. That's very important for us. We're very data-driven. We're probably not the right guys. If your startup is a super cool viral tool that will just grow because people love it, we're very systematic guys. So we work a lot with systematic customer acquisition, systematic customer retention, and we're not great marketing minds. We're really just control freaks in a way, looking at numbers a lot. That's why all of our startups typically have a very good BI infrastructure. And if you come basically do a deal with us, we would give this to you right away. It requires some adaptation. I'm going to speak some about it later. But we're going to give it to you even though the total cost, just looking at production time alone, is probably even in the high six figures, maybe even $1 million or more of a euro amount. But this is one of the examples that we want to give to you right away. Feel free to use it in whatever way you want, but we want to try to get some value out of the network effects that we have in this portfolio. And one of it is that we can actually create software and give it to people. And one of the software pieces we created is something that we call Eve and Z. That's the name that we just give it internally. And that is basically our e-commerce platform. From all of our history, we're deeply rooted in e-commerce. Just happens to be out of the Rocket Internet history, and we've been doing a couple of e-commerce companies all along. And quickly you reach certain points where the traditional shop software, traditional e-commerce software just doesn't work out. And I want to share with you some lessons learned about how we built that software, both a bit from a technical perspective, but also from an organizational perspective. And maybe that gives some inspiration to you guys when you create your own tech projects going forward. A bit of background. This is not the highest resolution, but you can see 4 out of our 19 companies that we have started in the past 1.5 years. The last one here, yeah, it's really hard to see. This guy is Sebastian Vettel. I don't know if any guys of you know him. He's the Formula 1 world champion 3 times in a row, probably going to be a 4th time. We did a company with him together that was called Tyrando. It's basically selling the sexiest product on earth, which is car tires. Obviously, the world was in utter need for another platform that sells car tires. We started this company 1.5 years ago, right after the inception of the fund. And based on this technology, we were able to scale a company to around 50 million euros in revenue in year 2. And sold it actually for the same amount in cash just a couple of months back, which was quite cool for us because we started as a new fund. So after 12 to 16 months, we already had the first exit. It was really much enabled by this technology. Yeah. Another company, just to give you an example, Wine and Black is a shopping club for wine. So as you know, the Vin Privé, the Brands Club model, we take that to the male audience and sell them wine. There's also a business that works very well in Germany as well as in Brazil. NU3 is a shop for dietary supplements. So it's pills and food and special little things that you take in to be more healthy, more beautiful, or you gain muscle and all that kind of stuff. There's also a model that works very well for us in Germany as well in Brazil. Yeah, and all of those sites, you see, they look pretty different, right? There's not a great overlap, but they all use the same software stack. We use those. Even that's a bit of a complicated name. It comes from a fact that there's a front end and a back end system. So Even Z is the name of the software system. We use it for straight e-commerce, like Tyrando, for example. We use it for shopping clubs. We also use it for marketplaces. So, sorry. One of our latest investment is, I mentioned this on the other stage where I got laughed about it because of the grandiose terms, but it's the largest marketplace for emerging art in the world, to my knowledge. So there's around 100,000 artists on the website who have uploaded 1 million of art pieces, and you basically can, in a highly curated eBay-like environment, buy individual art pieces, which is a great business because those artists, they wouldn't be able to live as an artist if they wouldn't do that, because maybe they cannot get into a gallery or something like that, but they can just upload it to a website and then show it to collectors from all over the world. Obviously that's great because you help make people a living out of art, but then on the other side, it's also a great business because the average painting is like $1,000 and we take like a 30% share of that in a marketplace model. So that's a pretty cool model. And it also works for that. And it also works for subscription models. So basically it's a pretty generic system. Yeah. Where did we come from? Why did we decide actually to do our own stuff? Because e-commerce, you might argue, it's not really something where there's a lot of sexiness in it, right? Technology-wise, most of the challenges probably have been solved somewhere. But if you look at an e-commerce startup, one thing that we did in the beginning, that a lot of companies probably do, is start with Magento or something like that. You could also use Shopware or Oxid or even a Shopify or whatever. And I think it's a pretty good start. So when we started also at Rocket, our first companies really were built on Magento, which is an open source software. It's PHP based, so you really can get up to speed quite quickly. It's easy to implement. There's a huge developer base because it's open source software, which also makes it quite easy for you guys to recruit people. It has a lot of features, and it's actually sufficient until you reach a certain level of scale. Then it becomes a problem because the whole architecture isn't really optimized for great performance when it scales up. And suddenly you reach a certain point where you understand that your tech teams, they're working really much more against the system in a way that they want to keep it stable and up and running rather than actually develop new features. So typically what you see is that your development speed, the output of your developers really goes down with scale because they're so much focused on keeping the systems running. Yeah. Some special cases, the order processing in the back end, everything that happens actually after a consumer buys. And then again, in our definition, when I talk about e-commerce, we mean everything transactional. So it doesn't have to be a situation where somebody buys, enters his credit card details, and something is actually shipped to him. But it also could be, for example, an online dating website where somebody clicks on buy, he puts in his credit card, and then he's only digitally allowed to now contact the other person. So we know all of those systems by that, basically. But everything that happens after the order processing also is not a strength of Magento. It's really, it prints out lists, basically, and there's some plugins and so on, but really, it's not that great. And then again, the business intelligence part is something that's very important for us, but really building strong reporting based on Magento databases is not that easy. So what we did, basically, at Rocket, we built a system, it was called Alice and Bob. That was basically at our old company, Alice and Bob. Alice, a very lightweight front end, Bob, the heavy worker on the back end who does all the heavy lifting. And basically, when we left Rocket at the end of 2011, we built a new system which is called Eve and Z. So it's totally coincidence that the names are kind of similar, obviously. But the architects of the systems are also, in large parts, it's the same people, basically. But this was actually a very nice opportunity because at the end of 2011, we left the old company where we had done this before. The developers were guys that we've been working together with 5 to 10 years, and now they have a chance of doing something very unique, which is, by the way, we want to do something similar again, but we have nothing. It's a green field, basically. So you rebuild everything. So the first thing the guys did was spend a couple of weeks basically just thinking about what is the right choice of technologies and so on, and then they build it again. And it's quite amazing to see how much higher the quality of the output is. If it's the same guys who've been doing it once again, you give them time to think, what are our mistakes, and we build it again from scratch, based on nothing. So that was pretty cool, actually. And now we have the system that we're kind of proud of. Okay, this is probably pretty hard to read. I'm sure there's some way that you guys can get these slides. It's probably for the really technical, interested people in the audience. Mainly, the system is divided into three main parts: the front end, which is called Eve; the back end, which is called Z; as well as this part down here, the data warehouse. So there are actually three main parts that our typical e-commerce infrastructure would entail. And quite easy. The customers come to the front end, and this front end, it's really built in a very, very lightweight way, which is extremely important for us because scale is something that is happening pretty fast, and we want to make sure that this page loads extremely snappy. And we achieve that basically by really limiting this execution speed here. By, for example, the front end itself doesn't have any database interactions. The interactions only start to happen when somebody actually clicks on placing an order. And this is basically the moment in time where everything then is being shifted to the back end, and basically it works on its different time, right? So the front is really just optimized just for display. There's no full page cache, and it's really focused on fast development. So if you can build a front end system that is based on the YE framework, for example, which should be known to your front end developers, you can achieve a very high speed in the front end system alone, while not doing a lot of database stuff, which is all being done in the back end. This is, for the people of you who have some background in technology, obviously this is not really surprising. This is the way it's supposed to be done. But surprisingly, a lot of the commerce systems that get off the shelf, it doesn't work that well. And this is actually pretty good. All the external providers, logistics, payment, fulfillment, also mailing, they all feed into the back end. And the link basically of the actually product data going back into the front end happens via Solar search server, basically. And then I think the most important part here is the business analytics part. Now, obviously, everybody starts with implementing a bit of Google Analytics, Kissmetrics, or some tool like that. What we understand under BI and data warehousing is much, much more complete. So the marketing part is very important. That's why we feed all the data into there. That is basically coming out of the marketing channels. So first of all, your SEM account, your display account, your SEO scorings, all that stuff. We all put it into the data warehouse, and then we map it towards the actually order and customer data. And what we achieve in the end is basically a complete view of the actual company. Just to give you one example. When we think about customer acquisition for a company like Tyrendo, we do not only look at what's the cost of acquisition and what's the cost per order and what's the order value, but actually it's a much more complex view. What we're trying to achieve is looking at what are the different touch points that a customer had before he actually converts, because typically there's a long time delay, he has multiple touch points with the company, so you have to attribute resources and costs accordingly. Because the simplistic view that somebody clicks on one ad, then he goes to the page and then he buys, that's just simply not reality. What happens is people have 4, 5, 6, even more contacts over a period of time, and it's actually quite a challenge to measure them correctly. And then in the meantime also think, so how much did all of those contacts cost? How much is the order worth that is coming out? And how should I split actually the revenue that's coming out on those different contacts in the front end? And this is only the customer acquisition part. If we then continue to think about how much is the customer relationship actually worth, I have to think about how many times is actually the guy going to reorder. So if you're going to reorder, like in Zalando's case, 3 to 4 times a year, I can estimate how much is the order value going to increase, and then I get a complete view. That's very much different from just looking at one cost, one revenue, but it's a much more complex view, especially since we also include data, for example, out of the logistics system, because you also have to understand how often do people return, because that's a killer, obviously, in all e-commerce models. You really want to control your return rate. So, for example, getting logistics data also back in the data warehouse only puts you in a situation where you really can analyze your stuff. Yeah, but I'll talk some about it even later. Now, one thing that's also pretty important is one common criticism of off-the-shelf system is obviously that they all look a bit the same, right? Because they have a standard front end, you modify a bit here, but if you have a very well experienced e-commerce developer, if he looks at the checkout process, for example, he will be able to tell you, okay, that's Magento, because it all kind of looks the same. What we do in the portfolio is we share code between the different ventures. For example, this is shared between all of those 3 companies, and it's shared actually within all companies. And we have a team centrally located at Project A that develops specifically for that core. So in that core is, for example, the basic architecture, front end, back end. In that core is the functionality, how do I process payments? In that core is the whole order processing part, which is obviously pretty complex in a marketplace situation. So the core consists, for example, contains the logic in which we can model very complex order processes. When I order something on Saatchi online, first I have to contact the artist. The artist basically has to confirm, yes, I still have the artwork, and I want to choose that shipping provider. Then it goes back to the shipping provider. They basically have to give you dates and times when they could pick it up. The artist has to reconfirm. In that moment, we can capture the money. In that moment, we file something with the customs authorities in the respective country, and so on. So that's fully automated. And the logic, not to actually do that in a specific Saatchi case, but the overall logic to actually create such a system, that is also in the core. It's done via state machines, like finite state machines, if anybody of you has very high technical interest. And then we have a second layer, which is venture specific, so it's company specific. Based on that code that we give you in the core, the companies then create their own value, their own code. So that would mean, for example, Saatchi Online configures the state machine, the order processing in a way that's suitable for their business model, whereas Tyrendo, they create code that basically configures the state machines in a way that they can sell tires with that. And then one other really important thing about this system is there's even another level that is focusing on country-specific or store-specific applications. So with the system, it's easy to do different stores. Now that could be a German version, a Polish version, a Ukrainian version, a Russian version, but it also could be both in German, and one is a B2B and one is a B2C version. And every time you have to basically a chance to overwrite code that is being done in the layer beyond, below that. And that's basically the way we can make sure that everybody has their own page, all of the front end, really the HTML, the CSS, that's always venture specific, so no 2 systems look alike. But at the same time, we give updates of the core to all of the companies. So out of our fund, we invest a certain amount of money to have a dedicated team that only works on the core functionality. And that is actually something where we think we can get a lot of competitive advantage, because even if a small company cannot invest heavily in IT, they still will get regular updates. And for us, it's not a problem, because we have many companies who might pay 1,000 or 2,000 euros of license fee if they receive an update from us. Just a couple of features, maybe what is interesting. Yeah, probably we can skip that, but this is also, when you look at the whole feature set, actually you reach a point where when you go with an open source software like Magento, you have to work on your own stuff. For example, voucher discounts and couponing. It sounds easy, but it's actually quite a complicated matter. What happens if you have combined orders, if there's a return of only one item, how do you then attribute the cost of the voucher and so on? So that's not that easy. Internationalization is a big thing for us because we're based in Germany, which is a small country. So all of our companies, right from the beginning, have the ambition to grow internationally. So we put a lot of emphasis on the translation aspect as well as the store concept I was just explaining before. What else do we have? Yeah, one thing that's also pretty important is we integrate a lot of marketing technology right from the beginning into the system. One thing that happens typically when you start adding more and more marketing campaigns and marketing technologies is you always have to integrate those little pixels, right? So every different marketing channel, they have their own little pixel that you need to implement, like a small little piece of code that has to be on every page so that you can actually get a full view of what's going on. If, for example, you include retargeting, which is the display ads that follow you around the web. Once you have visited the page once, you have to implement a pixel on every page. And it's very good to have a system that allows for very easy management of the pixels. It's just a very specific thing, but also the little details, I think, that make the system quite strong. Yeah. A couple of decisions that we did. Why do we do the separation of the front end and the back end? It's just very different tasks. So if you look at in traditional e-commerce websites, there's probably like 100 people coming to a website, 10 put something in the shopping basket, only one buys something. And there's one guy that actually buys something. We push him to a different system, whereas the 110 before, we keep in a different system. PHP, we're going with PHP because it's not the most beautiful coding language probably in the world, but people can get up to speed quite quickly. And for us, also from a recruiting perspective, it's actually quite important because you can get PHP developers basically all over the world. Yeah, so that is quite good. Plus also the cost of salary is not as high as, at least in Germany, as it would be, for example, for Java or Ruby. So for startups, it's actually a pretty good choice. We combine it with proven technologies, so Solar and the like. We don't go for example, for MongoDB just yet, no SQL stuff, but we're a bit behind the curve probably in latest technology, just because we want to make sure the technology is really proven and we find enough people who are already capable of working with it. Typically our companies scale quite quickly, so it's important for us to be able to find enough people in a short amount of time. For example, for the Tyrrendo company, the car tire dealer, we had to recruit like 20, 25 engineers within a year. That's quite a challenge if you want to have really high qualities of expectations quality. Yeah. Now maybe one thing again about this data warehouse, and then I'm also basically already through. This is really interesting, and this is probably if there's one important point that I can stress is that definitely when you start your own companies, think closely about how do I actually measure all this stuff. It's a pretty complex task, and we just, very simplistic, we put a couple of sources. One is the shop backend, where obviously all the order data goes in. Another one is web analytics. You might want to use something additional to Google Analytics or something like that, because one thing you really want to have is raw data. Even if you don't use it in the beginning, think about a way how you actually can log everything that's happening on the website. For us, it's extremely important because Google Analytics gives us very nice graphs and very nice overviews, and it gives a cool view on the aggregate level. But we are always thriving for eliminating the mean. So we want to analyze further, even smaller brackets, even smaller customer groups. And for that, you need the raw data. Otherwise, it's really hard to separate basically men from women, right? That's for a fashion e-commerce company. It sounds easy, but it's one of the very first elementary steps, understanding is this guy a woman or a man. And for that, you need on an individual visitor level, what kind of stuff has he looked on? And this data you want to have in a data warehouse, so you need to have your own, either your own tracking engine or something like WebTrack, which we use, which is a German company that provides you Google Analytics-like functionality, but also access to the raw data. So that's very important for us. Also what goes in is CRM tools, could be MailChimp, could be something more sophisticated, also including all the raw data. And then all the marketing tools. Google AdWords gives you data, Facebook advertising gives you data. Those are all the data sources that you definitely want to put together. And this is something that takes a long time, right? It's not a very easy thing to fully implement that, but once you reach a certain level, just as I described, when you reach the point where you understand the whole customer acquisition process with all its different contacts and the whole customer retention process, and then maybe also can do that on a cohort level. So understand not only that's my overall performance, but if I want to look at people who signed up in July, who came in via this marketing campaign, and if I look at only this group and understand, oh, those guys perform much better than everybody else, then obviously that makes me able to reach a point where I can really scale, because then I'm only going to focus on those guys and not spend money on all the other people who are not as important. And that is some very, and oftentimes, at least in e-commerce, that's one of the big keys to scaling. So that's why we put so much emphasis on that. Obviously, this is not going to happen overnight. So one thing you should do right now probably is just make sure you have all the data. So keep the data in raw format. If you look at your table structure, talk to your developers basically. Do they overwrite the last login of every user? So do you have a table with users where it says last login was last Saturday? Or do they keep a full list of all logins? And you definitely should do that. Keep all the data. Even if you can't analyze it right now, you're definitely going to be using it later. That's probably also one piece of advice I'd like to give right now. Yeah? And that's that basically. Yeah? That's basically all, just a couple of random thoughts about our systems that we built. I hope this is somehow helpful to you guys. Happy to share the slides. If there's any more questions regarding that, feel free to shoot me an email also. As I mentioned, I'm not trying to sell a product or anything, but maybe there were some interesting thoughts in there which you can use for your own startups and your own technical plans, basically. Yeah? Thanks.